Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Comic Banter. Tonight we are joined by two great artists within the industry. One we've had before, Drew Edward Johnson, artist on a litany of different titles, worked for a wealth of different companies as well. And then introducing for our first time, Carl, I know I've said your name before, but I always know I probably mess it up too. Karl Altstaetter?
Yeah, Altstaetter. That's fine.
Altstaetter. Okay. I'm gonna butcher it. I apologize.
No,
And Karl, worked in the industry for decades and for a wide variety of different companies as well. And of course, the biggest key factor for us today is that you've actually worked on this set of Marvel Universe trading cards.
yeah, yeah.
Our first introduction to you was from the Professor X card that at the time, we didn't know who it was. We were like, it looks like this artist. It looks a little bit like this artist. Who could it be? And Drew was on that episode, and he's like, you know what? This looks really familiar. I think I know who this is.
As I probably should have had a better signature or something on it.
No, they just, I mean, as is the case with some of these cards, they crop it out. Either it's cropped out, or it's like like some artists will find like, oh, I'm going to hide it on the foot, so no matter what, you can't crop it out. It's stuck in there. But then other times, like there's several different artists on this set and cards that were like, wait, who did this one? Whose art was this? And it's like, it looks familiar, and it's like, could it be a Paul Ryan because it's kind of his, or is it a Tom Morgan? It's like on the fence of a few different guys. So
yeah, and those cards are drawn. I think they're like 2 up or 3 up from the actual printed card, so they're actually, there's not a ton of detail you can get into them. You know, they're that's why I think what happens once they get reduced, and there's that heavy, I don't know if Paul Mounts did all the colors on them.
It looks like.
Yeah. Which is amazing that I'd remember that. But yeah, that's just the geek coming out. But yeah, that they're done so small that I think when they get reduced, some of the style gets, it's a little bit harder to read.
Yeah. Especially depending, like if you're working with an inker who don't work with that regularly and doesn't know your style. And I know Terry Austin did a bunch of these, and it's like, if he was doing the majority of them, you're going to get Terry's inks on all of them. Whereas when you're working with an inker that you've, built a rapport with, they're like, no, I know how to highlight your lines. I know how to, give you the right depth. And if it's someone who's just kind of like, he's jamming them all out, like Paul was, you're not going to get maybe the attention and time you could with someone and so that might have been the case too. Did you ink your own pieces? Or actually, I know who inked your pieces because we talked about it on the last episode.
So on that piece, on the Professor X, that was Jim Lee inked that piece.
Yeah.
And then on the Bishop piece, I think that's Scott Williams.
I think it's Jim because I think it's signed in the corner.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, then that must be the X-Force.
Yeah, probably the X-Force. But that's interesting to know that Scott did that one. So when you say it's a 3-up size, I've seen some pieces and it looks like they're almost on they do 2 cards on a 11 by 17, and that's just kind of sideways, and then they drop it in there. And so that was one of the things that I'm like, okay, so is that how it is for all of them? And I would definitely want to touch on all that. But I do know that we're going to have, as we go on, we tend to get more and more viewers. So I want to be able to get some of them to have a chance to bring in some more discussions. So in case I want to check in too, how's everybody been doing? How's your week been?
You want to go first, Drew?
Pretty chill. Just drawing Godzilla still. Kids are in school here at the house. My wife is working here at home. So, same old.
Nice. Karl, are there any projects you can talk about that you're working on, or is it all kind of?
Well, like we were talking about before the show started. So I work for Spin Master, and I work on the Batman toys. And so we work on what's called the core Batman line that you see at Target, you see it at Walmart. And specifically, I work on the 12-inch line, which are the really huge figures. And so that's, very always busy. And same as Drew, I have my kids doing the schooling here. And that's all totally different. But I think we're kind of getting used to it. We have like sort of a rhythm that we've fallen into with it. But I have to say there are times when all three of us are having Zoom meetings, and it's just it's so strange still, you know.
Yeah. And everyone's just like sitting there talking to their computer while they're all in separate rooms. You're like, this is just odd. And
yeah, it is a little bit odd, you know.
and also like taking to, I mean, for me to a certain degree, this is the socialization. Like I have a few friends who I meet up with online like this now, and it's like this has been the new kind of like, oh, you know, we'll have a meal, we'll talk and stuff, but it's a little bit different. Like you don't get to, it's you're still trying to find that company or like have that social engagement, and it's all through a screen, and it's like that's such a, and then adding that to the work Zoom meetings too. You're like, okay, how does this work out? But we're making it work. That's the best thing we can say.
Yeah, I've had that with a couple friends where I've met and I'll be drawing, they'll be drawing, and we'll be talking back and forth, and it can work. It's just I still do feel there's that missing element, you know, where when you have someone on the screen, you almost have this odd thing like I need to watch the screen because we've been trained to watch screens, you know, like it's like a show. It's like, hey, it's a show with my friend on it. I'm gonna watch it while you're drawing. You ignore it for a second. You're like, wait, I'm in the room by myself. Oh, I'm not. There's somebody here. You know.
Yeah. We've already got a few comments. We do have Optimus Dixon says, Mr. Altstaetter, can you say your name once so I can know how to say it officially pronounced? Yeah. I guess we covered that briefly at the beginning, but for those just joining us, it is Karl Altstaetter.
Yeah.
I hope. Yeah.
And when I was fortunate enough to visit Germany, and when I was in Germany, everyone said it was Altstaetter, and I was like, okay, sure.
You're like, okay, yeah.
Yeah. But it was, I think, you know, the English pronunciation is still Altstaetter.
Okay.
Because we don't have that. What's the weird U thing with the two dots?
Oh, the umlaut?
Yeah.
There you go.
I don't have an umlaut.
Yeah.
I have an AE instead of an umlaut.
Nice. All right. And we've already got some fun, some comments in here that are saying like, there's something to be said about talking over people. Yes, but we're trying to be good about that here. Definitely there's a little bit of lag sometimes. We try and keep it covered. Light bulb working together. I'm saying the light bulb moments when working together gets some sometimes gets lost sometimes.
Yeah. I really miss at my studio before we closed it up. You know, just one of the guys walking past my table and, you know, noticing something good or ill on my drawing board, and you know, them just piping in with a fix or a compliment or something. And, you know, 9 times out of 10, it's a fix, but their advice was always good. And, you know, it always made my work better. So I was always happy for it, you know? So I do miss that quite a bit.
Yeah, that's got to be one of the benefits, like from hearing different artists at cons and stuff like that. When the few that have had the chance to work in a studio setting, that they have that kind of like, oh, hey, like everyone kind of works together to raise, you know, there's a term for like raises all boats. A rising tide raises all boats, and so everyone working together just kind of lifts each other up and says like, oh, hey, they'll see something else and be inspired, and like that's got to be definitely. I'm curious how much that's affecting the arts. And so when we think about the movies that are in production, and we know that the Marvel has a huge art department, and those guys who may have been working together at one point are now separated, how will that come across? I mean, they're still fantastic artists, but I'm curious if we'll see if those with the trained eye will spot something like, oh, hey, that's kind of interesting. They went here instead of here. So.
Yeah, it's made it interesting to work in this strange year.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like it used to be.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed is, you know, when we're using Zoom, there's the actual meetings, but I feel like the meetings are more like top line-ish, you know, like you just kind of talk about the bigger issues that you may be dealing with on a particular project. But a lot of the work gets done in the chat. So you drop an image into the chat, and if you're one-on-one with someone, it actually works quite well in the sense you can go back and forth like pretty quickly. In a group kind of environment, you drop it into a group chat, and then you'll start to see right away, like it's like bloop, 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 good, 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 bad, 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 bad. Like it's almost like people are voting. You know what I mean? You'll see like the little emojis pop up. It's an interesting way to work. It does have its benefits in that it's all, anything that you're working with is right there available and present for you. It's just, I think, to your point, when you're in a normal setting with people, you get that opportunity for something spontaneous, I think more discussion wise. Like you can say, oh, what about if we tried this? And someone say, all right, cool, let me do a quick sketch. You know what I mean? Where you don't see that quite as much with this.
Yeah, I miss that a lot because my old studio mate, Chris Moreno, used to be so good about, like I'd be working out cover sketches or something, or I'd be stuck on something. And he would come over and just give me that right nudge in a direction that would put me onto what was going to be a really badass cover. And he really did that for a couple of my covers, really put me on the right footing when I wasn't quite sure where it was going yet. And he could see it walking past me when I couldn't see it, which was always incredibly helpful. So I really do miss that. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Not to mention leaving the house. Leaving the house was nice too.
Yeah. Going down toy aisle, seeing like, wait, what's in the shop today? Okay, cool. All right. They got the new Nightwing. All right, I'm good.
Yeah.
All right.
I still got to get to the comic shop so I can get that new Adam Hughes Hellboy.
Oh, yeah.
That came out this week.
Let's see. All right, so we are all set now. We're gonna go ahead and jump in. Actually, let me adjust something over here. And let's see. Last we had wrapped up with our Secret Origins section. And so we are jumping back a little down and bringing the praise.
Were you literally going through the checklist?
No, I was good. I was going through the checklist on my like little slide bar, but I was bringing up this card because this was the last one we had covered, but before we step into heroes. And so this was Thor by Ron Frenz, the origin story, and it's like it stayed, as we talked about the last time, it stayed pretty static throughout the years, and so it was kind of interesting to see how some of the origins have been updated, some of them have shifted, but most of them had stayed pretty in line. So we're jumping into teams today, and our first team today is the Avengers by Steve Epting, which I thought was kind of interesting because I don't think he did too many previous cards. Like looking at, like I had gone through, and we always try to find every artist we can. And you'd actually see on this card makes it a little easier for us because it does have a signature in this bottom corner around Circe's foot. It does have a signature, so it made it a little easier for me to pick it out. But yeah, Steve Epting doing the Avengers, and these are all done with a fairly good sized cast, and you get to see like, oh, these had 7 people on it, and I remember this era more for the brown leather jackets, but I guess that's more in the next card set.
Funny.
Oh, we lost that. But yeah, like I mean, this was the Avengers I first got used to because this is the card sets that I was collecting. So Vision was all white, and that's also how he was in the Data East video game. Thor, this is Eric Masterson Thor as well. So people like later on, people say, "Oh yeah, Donald Blake Thor." I'm like, "Who's that?" Like I didn't know. And like there's it's like that was the time frame that I came in on, and like Black Knight was the guy. So like yeah, this was my first introduction. The Avengers Mansion. It's funny too because the design looks different from what I had remembered. But later on I remember just the classic mansion. This is more of a compound look to it.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just. It's interesting to look back at Epting's style back then too, because he totally changed up after his time at CrossGen. He really just went up a level or two when he was at CrossGen and came out the other side. So much more stylish, so much more exciting to look at. So it's weird to go back and see where this feels a lot to me like Marvel's house style, especially on Avengers at those times, kind of had like a who am I thinking?
Tom Palmer vibe.
Brian, huh?
A Tom Palmer vibe.
Yeah, and like Paul Ryan and oh God, what's his name? The guy who drew all the Avengers comics for such a long time and Captain America. Ron Lim.
Oh, Ron Lim. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. It's like they were good realistic drawings, but they didn't have a lot of stylistic, kind of offshoots to the drawings. These are the time were not what was really attracting my eye when I was younger. But like now, I would jump on a Steve Epting book as soon as I saw it. They're just gorgeous. It's just interesting to see the path everybody's art takes over the years. When you come out the other side.
Yeah. I've already got someone in chat saying I think that they should have gone with the compound title over mansion. Makes the Avengers seem like a wine club that meets during the day. Fair enough. Like that's definitely it definitely has a different feel when you think of mansion versus compound. But yeah, this is what we do later on see in the movies, in fact. But initially it's just like an old like Wayne Manor type mansion. And eventually it evolved and like this is, I mean, I think of Jarvis like dusting. That's not what you're gonna have here.
And also too, I think it's got the vision where John Byrne turned him into sort of the Dr. Manhattan type vision.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely see that.
Was he that powered up?
What's that?
Was he that powered up?
I don't think he was that powered up, but he had that kind of like I'm erased of all emotion, kind of distant character kind of version of him. And I think when he first had him come back, he was without the cape and was totally white like that. And then the cape kind of came later. Might have been West Coast Avengers.
There is a West Coast Avengers in a bit, but that is interesting too because it's like he does go from the red, yellow, and green to this monochromatic just white, and that definitely evokes that Dr. Manhattan feel to it. And I'd never noticed that before. That's really cool to hear. Let me see. It's funny too because we just earlier when we were doing the team ups, they had shown us their version of Scarlet Witch along with Vision. And it was the green and yellow and red. And like, this was the version that I had gotten used to. And then just kind of like by going over to that new style, it definitely has a character change there. I'm curious if there was there a story point that had happened that had altered his standing point, or I'm trying to remember.
He got short circuited somehow.
Okay.
And then when he came back, he was, I'm pretty sure it was a West Coast Avengers story.
Gotcha.
Sounds like.
Another comment in chat: did Silver Surfer complain about the similarities without the cape? I mean, I can see it. He's just like kind of like, that's my thing. I'm the monochromatic guy, and now they're stepping on my toes.
I often wonder, like when, whatever the time you come into comics and you see a team that you really like, that's forever like your version of the team. Like when I think of the Avengers, I always think of like the Iron Man, Captain America, Thor. That lineup from kind of the late 70s, early 80s kind of thing. And so when I see this, I'm like, wow, that's such a really different group of Avengers. But I'm sure if you came in at this time, you were like, hey, that's my squad.
Yeah.
Same thing with X-Men. X-Men's like that as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I started to use the term just like that's your headcanon. Like this is the team that should always be on there. Like my version of Nightwing is very specifically Scott McDaniel, Chuck Dixon, like that era of Nightwing. Not that anything else after is necessarily bad. It's just like that's not the Nightwing portrayal that I prefer. I like his I like his slim costume, except for the gauntlets that act as pouches. And like some of the later designs, I appreciate that they're trying to take new strides, but part of me is like, no, this is the one that makes the most sense. Because that was the first like Nightwing run that I had read. So, and it's just, you kind of just get in that headcanon space of like, oh no, this is the version that is the best. And like for me, my Avengers were the new Avengers. So Captain America, Spider-Man, Wolverine, Iron Man.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I read them regularly. I had comics of the Avengers before and also like from other crossover events. But the time where I read like a full run and like, from issue 1 on was the new Avengers, which is, it's definitely dates me. Like it's very much that era. So
I started off with the, I want to say it was either Buscema or Perez in the 70s. I can't remember. it's I started when I was 5 or 6 on comics, so but I always remember it was the team that had Wonder Man and the Beast, and like that era. So I
Yeah.
always have, yeah, I have big love for the red leisure suit and sunglasses Wonder Man. I still love him flying around in his silly jetpack from his belt and stuff. And yeah, that's the stuff I always look back and that's my guys.
That makes me think about the I don't know if this is a rabbit hole or if we're allowed to go down rabbit holes, but the you
This
guys,
whole
of
show is
course,
a rabbit hole.
everybody of course everybody remembers the Michael Golden Avengers annual where Rogue was in it.
Yeah.
And that to me is like, that is the Avengers right there. That whole team, that whole group, and the way it was done, that to me is like the penultimate Avengers to me. But that dates me too.
Yeah.
It's also an epic job.
Another comment. I totally agree with Coral. Said as Rick from The Walking Dead. Sorry, I had to say it. Thank you, Cream.
It's not the first
time. Yeah, there's. I had a thought and it completely escaped me there. Moving on, we've got the next card by first time one of the artists that are only make a few appearances, but Karl Altstaetter doing an X-Force, and this is when I definitely enjoy when we talk about our headcanons. This one's always locked in as that original team for me, but of course it goes on to some of the later stuff with Jason Aaron. But this was X-Force at this beginning. You've got the New Mutants graduate and decide we're gonna step it out, and Cable takes them under his wing, and we get the X-Force. And I mean, I guess jump right in, Karl. How did this piece come to be in front of you?
Well, this was when I was part of Homage Studios way back in the day, and I was starting to get jobs from Marvel on my own, and this was along with annuals and stuff like that. They would pass these kind of out to people to sort of wet their feet, get them going, and now it's funny, now that I'm looking at the back of the card, it's all kind of jogging my memory. I remember them giving you a list of characters that had to be on the card, and as well as giving you reference for where their base was and what they wanted on the back. And I think that had a lot to do with what they'd already written for the card.
Okay.
So, and I remember very specific that there had to be a square underneath a lot of the teams. So if you see that, I think that's a consistent design element. Yeah. One of the things that really jumps to my mind is I believe the coloring on these was done on Blue Line. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah. For those that are for those that are listening that aren't familiar, Blue Line is usually a Blue Line pencil that they kind of start the baseline when they build their structure of the characters and of the art piece, and then they go over it. They initially would go over in a regular black pencil, and then on top of that inks, and then so when it scans and it's fed into the printers and stuff, all that it picks up is the darker colors and leaves a blue line as the base, so it's not picked up at all.
That's 90% of it.
Okay.
Just a little slight kind of addition to what you're saying is they would print the line art, like you said, in non-photo blue on a piece of Bristol board or artboard, and they would also attach a piece of line art that was printed on translucent plastic, and it would overlay perfectly matched up with the blue line underneath it, and then you would lift up the line art and you would paint on it. So a lot of people used acrylics, they could airbrush, they could do a lot of different stuff. It was like pre-computer. And then as you can see, a lot of these, they use colored pencil to do some of the definition in the arms and so forth. And then they would take those and they would align them, black line art on a translucent piece of plastic over that painted work. And then they would take a photograph of it. And then that's what they would use as print.
That's crazy because it's almost like an animated cell where you're working in those different layers. That's crazy.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So one of my roommate when I first started on comics is a painter named Joe Chido.
Oh,
And
dude. I'm sorry. Go on. Nerd it out. Carry on.
so yeah, Joe's a fantastic artist. And so he and I spent a lot of time together. Obviously, when you're roommates, you spend a lot of time with someone, and your studio mates. So it's literally, you never get away from each other, you know. So one day I was, you know, watching him paint, and I said to him, "Hey man, can you teach me how to paint?" And then he was like, I don't know if I really want to teach people, and so forth. And then the next day he showed up with a big box of these animator paints, these acrylic animator paints. And he says, I'll teach you to paint, but you got to block in the colors for me on all these blue lines I'm doing. So he was doing the Hellraiser comic, not the Hellraiser comic, Nightbreed.
Okay.
And so, yeah, so that was the first time I saw how that works. So basically you would have the board and you would begin the painting. You block in the color all the same way you do digitally, but you're blocking it in with acrylic. And then he would come in over that and he would paint the highlights, the shadows, and then use colored pencil or you know, a really like a white acrylic paint or a yellow acrylic paint to create rim lighting and so forth. And that's, I think, how like Electra Assassin was done. I know Dark Knight was done that way. So a lot of these books from that era that had that kind of painterly quality, they all use a similar thing to that.
That's really, that's crazy cool to hear. And it's when you said I'm sorry, it's Chiodo or
Joe Chida.
Joe Chito. It makes total sense because you mentioned Homage Studios earlier, and my brain's like, oh, and that perfectly clicks because he was working with that studio as well. So that's
he kind of came in midway through that that group, and then he moved back to Sandy. It's a long, probably unnecessary conversation, but anyways, yeah, he was a part of it, and amazing talent.
Yeah. Kareem in chat wants to ask, what was the thought behind Domino's pose? As a fan, I'm always happy to see depictions of her. Just wondering. And so, I mean, I know how clear the photo is there for you to see.
Well, I got to be honest. If I was drawing it today, I would have drawn her facing outward instead of facing inward. This was for me. You got to remember where I was in terms of my career and learning things. As you can see, the character in the foreground is probably more thought out than all the other characters. And I was still learning how to layer characters in space. So I would draw the characters sort of separately and then compose them back onto the paper and try to create, you know, this sort of effect that they were layered in space and proportion wise. But for me, having two flying characters, a big character, which of course, you know, you always have a Colossus or a Hulk in the back. And then you want some of these characters that are maybe more aggressive or popping out, you know, to kind of create that fan or that arrow effect. But she's definitely not working with the rest of the team in terms of making that happen. So if I was to
she's like, you guys go out there. I'll be right here.
I'll just hang back here and look cool, or try to look cool. So yeah, if I was doing it today, yeah, there'd probably be a lot of different things. But yeah, long answer to your question.
No, definitely. I think that's definitely kind of where he's going. He's just kind of curious how you build this character in when everything else is going on, and it's a lot of characters you have to kind of fulfill in one space. And as you said, it's only yay big, and you're like, okay, it's going to be shrunk down here, so you work within what the space you have.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing too, in that I think this might be another deep dive, and Drew probably he probably knows where I'm coming from when I talk about this, is that the kind of generation before us of artists, they really drew characters in the background as just sort of silhouettes or shapes or a series of shadows that kind of created this iconography. But then when this new era started, everything was fully rendered. You know, you'd have a car, you'd have a person in the background, and any person was almost drawn as if they were a big figure. And that was kind of a trend that was beginning to evolve. You know, I think a lot of that has to do with that era. But if you look back at older comics, it would just be a character as a shape, you know? And so in this, you have all these characters how many characters? 1, 2, 4,
8.
8 characters. That's a lot
Yeah.
for a little card.
Yeah, Sirens.
You know?
I was because I was looking at this card recently, or because I was scanning them, and we've talked about how like we're toy people, so we're always like, oh, these figures, 6 of them have been created. I'm sorry, of these 8 characters, 6 of them have been created as action figures. I'm like, wait, so who all here? Siren and Feral. I'm sorry, not Feral. Wolfsbane.
Yeah.
Have yet. Wait.
Oh,
Sorry, my brain's jello. Feral and Siren are the only 2 that haven't been created yet as action figures in the new line.
yeah, because they just did Boom Boom and Shatterstar and Cannonball.
Yeah, and then recently they just did the Warpath as part of the Strong Guy wave. So
it's actually a wave called Strong Guy.
Oh, it's
or Strong Guy, the character from X-Force.
He's from X Factor, yeah, but he's the Build-A-Figure. So you buy X amount of figures, and then suddenly you have a Strong Guy who without an arm, because I have yet to get that other character. So yeah, so the Build-A-Figure is you build Strong Guy. He came with a leg, and so you get Warpath, and then you get a leg for him. So now I've got a Strong Guy most of the way there.
Funny side story about that. So I worked at Mattel as well.
Okay.
And I worked on all the DC stuff there as well. And one of the things that we would always talk about in regards to the Build-A-Figures is like, what are the parts that people really, really want? They want the head, they want an arm or whatever. And you would put the like coolest looking part with probably the figure that we thought would sell the least. And I know people always speculate that. That's totally true. And then you're like, you actually think about how many of that character is in a carton.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much you guys know about how that's figured out, but you have a certain amount of money that you're trying to make with each carton, and so certain characters may be more expensive because they have more deco on them.
Yeah.
So you might say, well, we're going to have less of Harley Quinn because she has a ton of deco, and we're going to have more of Batman because one, he's popular and he's like not that much deco. So he's an inexpensive, popular figure. So you weight the box depending on that mixture of character choices.
Yeah. Optimus Dixon in chat says, I knew it. And there's definitely Marvel had, or Hasbro just recently, part of their announcement today as part of their Fans First Friday, they did the Stiltman Build-A-Figure, and one of the things they did, yeah, and so what they did is they did a generic Build-A-Figure. I'm sorry, a generic army Builder-Figure. It's a hand ninja, and he comes with extra legs. So if you get an army of hand ninjas, you'll have a giant Stiltman because each one comes with extra extensions. So you can just keep building. So I'm like, that was one of the times where I'm like, that makes a lot of sense that they would build this in that regard. Like,
I got that. That's awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the first Build-A-Figure I've ever wanted, Stiltman, dude. I love Stiltman from when I was a kid. Just the idea of this guy whose sole power is to get taller. It's just so great.
I mean, then you might be happy we're also getting Frogman in the same wave. So I don't know where you land. He's a repaint of the Dr. Octopus figure, but still it's solid. It's a new head and stuff. So yeah.
I love that you can see his face inside in shadow inside the frog's mouth. He looks like a Disneyland costume character.
Yeah.
Nice.
He made me think of a Jawa with just the 2 little eye dots in there. Like that's what I thought of. But yes, it does look like a character at Disneyland.
Yeah. Yeah, I just saw that. That made me really happy.
So you were mentioning the back of the card too. I'm guessing this is also your cable headshot as well as the mountain, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
All that's done as part of it when you do the kind of main piece of artwork, and then you'd submit it with the back part of it as well, as kind of separate but still usually on the same piece of paper.
Very cool.
I just got a nerd. That is, Carl, that is so cool. I love that headshot of Cable.
Thanks. I think you can thank Jim Lee for that though.
Oh, really?
He might have put more shadows in it.
Oh, dang.
Yeah. Oh, and this one too. We were talking before about inking. This one, if those looking closely, I'm trying to circle it with the red dot. You can see he signed it too, so he did ink this one as well. So
Oh,
yeah.
Jim did. Oh, okay.
Nope. I just flicked the wrong spoiler for that, but yeah, right here is where that little signature is. But yeah, spoilers for the next card. We've got Ron Lim's X Factor. You were just talking about Strong Guy. It's funny because it's like you talked about how everyone would have a square underneath them, and this is where a lot of the artists got their signatures in because it's like this one's Ron Lim is on there. You also have Milgram is the inker, I believe, and then Paul Mounts. Yeah, it's very like you've got to get down there, but Milgram is like right here under Ron Lim, and then over here is Mounts. Paul got his signature in there too. So yeah,
I thought it was Barry Austin for a second because of like this looks more stylized than Lim used to draw a lot. You know, like
it's interesting too because. Sorry, say that again.
Oh, just the heads are narrower, and you know, like it looks more stylized than I'm used to seeing from Lim.
Yeah.
You know, I know a lot of artists during that period of time. They used to talk about how they would create a light source with the line art drawing, and then the painted art would sometimes go against that. You know, that was like a lot of discussion about, you know, where the shadows would fall with this full paint. And that I think that has a lot to do with they were transitioning from traditional comic book coloring to this more, you know, you were starting to see this wasn't just on big high-end books like Dark Knight. Now it was, you know, on a trading card, and that's a big change in terms of how people are seeing color in comics.
Yeah, this one too. It's interesting. Did they have the grid work behind it? They had it on your card as well. Was that part of the setup that you guys included, or did they add that in post, so to speak?
Yeah, and I think that was part of that. When they would do the painted thing, they would put that behind them. That might have been like Letraset or something along those lines.
Okay. And this is a Peter David era of X Factor, which I definitely enjoyed. I like the Detective Agency more, but this was definitely a good time to be reading X Factor. I didn't get in during the Scott Jean and Beast era. This was more my first X Factor introduction. So I always dug this version of Havoc, and the giant fins on his head wasn't quite for me. I dug this kind of, essentially government-led mutant team with Val Cooper as their liaison, and that was kind of a fun era for me.
Yeah, I liked it too. I did start off with the original X-Men team, and I don't know. There's just a lot of drama that was always included with those characters, especially since they brought Jean back in the first issue, I think, or maybe no, that wasn't X-Men or Fantastic Four or something, and then they carried her over into X Factor #1. But I didn't get into it. I didn't stay with it very long, and then when these guys came on, that's when I stayed with them for a long time. I really liked this version of the team.
Yeah,
and Pete. So was this Havoc? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm good.
I was just going to say that Havoc costume was seems like a blend of the traditional X-Men outfit and the Extinction Agenda outfit that he wore.
Yeah, very much.
Sort of like an evolution of that.
Yeah. The book was originally drawn. This team's book originally was drawn by Larry Stroman.
Yeah,
and so he had designed the outfits, and they were really a lot more stylized and cutting edge, and like later artists kind of calmed them down a bit, but you know, Stroman's style was so stylized that sometimes it was hard to interpret, you know, like what little doodad was going where, or you know, that sort of thing. Not to criticize Stroman, because I love his work, but it was just, you know, it was interesting to see how later artists interpreted those outfits.
Yeah, his run on Alien Legion was fantastic.
Oh my God, yeah. No, I love his stuff.
I know there's at least one person in the chat too, Optimus Dixon, who loved his Tribe stuff. Like that's one of his favorite books.
Oh yeah, Tribe. Yeah, it was beautiful.
So yeah, let's see. Next up, we are touching base with the New Warriors. And this one, I kind of guessed that it was going to be Paul Ryan, because there's no signature, and like even though they do have the same square, there's nothing kind of tucked in there anywhere, and again they only have so much space because they've got kind of people kneeling and filling in that area. So I was like, go for it.
You think early Bagley?
I was curious, but Bagley hadn't done as. I couldn't tell if Bagley had done any of the other books, cards in this set. There's nothing signed, so it's hard to track that down. There was a Namorita that he had done, I'm sorry, there's a Namorita in the set that's unnamed. There's also a Phoenix that unnamed. There's a few that just can't. It's kind of nondescript enough, like it's in that Marvel house style, so it's like, just kind of like it could be any number of people. I thought Bagley a little bit, especially with the back of the card, the Night Thrasher head. That looks like Bagley to me, but I didn't want to misattribute it, so I just kind of held off and I went with Paul Ryan. So yeah, I don't know, Carl. If either of you have an idea too, I'm listening.
I'm thinking is Tom Morgan.
It could be Tom Morgan also worked on a bunch of these cards as well. We're going to see some of his stuff upcoming, but he did find a spot to every time his name is in there. So I'm like, is no signature a sign that it wasn't him? Because his stuff is usually pretty clearly noted.
See, I think it could be Bagley just because of the lips on the female characters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Where they have the all black John Byrne kind of lips.
Gotcha.
Which I think he was doing in that era.
Yeah. And I'm a big Bagley fan. He's one of we talk about our personal, like our favorites when we first start, and that's always going to be that signature style. Bagley was my first Amazing Spider-Man artist, and so I loved his stuff. I loved how kind of gangly and thin Spider-Man was. Like he wasn't a weightlifter. Like he was just like a little springy, nimble guy. And so like that was my Bagley, and I appreciated the McFarlane stuff that came before, but because that wasn't my first introduction, I just kind of like, I like Bagley more. So let me jump back to I had her a second ago. I was going to bring up the Namorita because we had looked at it and we're never able to kind of clarify who this was. And again,
that's McGuire.
That's McGuire?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's totally
I can see that. I can see that in the face, definitely.
Oh, okay. Can we do a speed round where the cards come up and we just yell a name?
Yeah, we can jump through a bunch of them. Most of them are named though, but like one's like, let me see here. This was the other one that was never. Here we go. Another one where I have no idea, and it's just kind of. It's kind of, there's no, like you can see Mount's signature on the side a little bit, but aside from that, there's no indicator to who it is and who, like who could have drawn this, and it's not distinct enough.
The head on the back of the card reminds me more of JRJR.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he did do a few cards in the set too, so. But it's also like there tends to be also some symmetry to the idea of who's drawing what. Like when you have Mark Texieri on all the Ghost Rider stuff, it flows. Like even in the team up cards, even in the other stuff, it's all Mark. And then all the like when you run up against the Guardians of the Galaxy, you're finding Jim Valentino, and it's there. So it's like I was always curious as to see like why would this one be, one artist, and then the rest are not named, or the rest are named, and she's left out in the cold.
Is that the name right there on the edge? Or is that Paul Mounts?
That's Mounts. Yeah, I've stared at that thing for hours, and it's like the top part of Mounts. So it's like you get the colorist, and because Paul did get his name in a lot of stuff, and I'm also curious where cards like this, what did you guys draw the frame, or is that done in post, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's done afterward. That looks like something that was airbrushed on there. And I'm beginning to think these backgrounds, if you look at the texture on them, they might have been photos.
Okay. Yeah, like this one in particular, when we were talking about there's no signature, there may have been one at one point but we believe it got cropped out. And this is the first this is one of our second show that we had Drew on, and we had Professor X and then touch base with you. And so this one, it's like, okay, there's no signature because I'm guessing was cropped out. Like it was left somewhere on the page, but they're like, okay, dropping in our space background, drawing a box around it, and you're done.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think the shape behind him with the X Mansion in the background, that was there. The second loop, of course, or the second sort of frame was done kind of in post, if you want to say it that way.
Yeah.
And then I think my signature was originally down there by the bottom of the bubble.
Okay.
And that just obviously got cropped out.
Yeah. Let me see. So yeah, there's I think that's the most of the ones where I couldn't name who they were, but I think there's like one or two more that it's just kind of like a shot in the dark. It's like, I think it's this, but let me see. Oh, there's definitely like Epoch is another one where it's like, I was guessing Greg Capullo because he had done the Quasar card and he had done the Maelstrom card, who also was also by Capullo and in the same storyline as part of the Quasar series. So this was just a guess, like maybe it's Capullo.
I could go with that.
Yeah.
What do you think, Karl?
Yeah, that looks like Quasar Capullo.
Yeah.
That style that he had during that era.
Yeah.
And it's you look at we're jumping around a lot, but you go from characters like Maelstrom, and that's very like, obviously they kept, which is interesting because at times they would keep the signatures in the piece, like it's very clearly right there, and they kept those. They decided to keep that, but then other times they'll just drop it out. But I guess it's because he framed his in a way that it made it more apparent, like keep this in.
Yeah,
I'm always kind of curious. And then
it's interesting to me that in some ways this is kind of like the Marvel Universe books.
Oh yeah, we get a lot of that. Like that's a lot of people's kind of first introduction to this, to like the larger world that is Marvel Universe. Because if you're only reading Spider-Man but you start collecting these cards, you're like, oh well, here's Quasar, and here's Sleepwalker, and there's and you're just getting to introduce to all these characters. And this was my version of Wikipedia, and of course the Marvel Universe.
And in that Marvel Universe, I think Joe Rubinstein inked like most of those. So no matter who you had draw the figure, he sort of brought a sort of consistency to it, which I think would have been neat with these cards too. But it is cool too when you get to see like more of the stylistic stuff.
Yeah, and that's been some of the joys of going from you go from an Eric Larson Spider-Man to Greg Capullo Quasar, and you're just going through so many different artists and seeing so many different takes. And it's great to see that variance for us. I mean, for me and for Victor, and a lot of times for a lot of the artists and the viewers, is because you're like, oh, I can't remember the last time I saw Lee Week's Gambit. And there you go. Let's see.
It's interesting how much Capullo's early work looked like John Romita Jr.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, if you just showed me that back of the card, I'd been like John Romita Jr.
Yeah, those eyes are very right there,
and the mullet.
That's
like of that era. That was a lot of that.
Yeah. All the X-Men books that John Romita Jr. did, everybody had big hair. Everybody was very blow dried.
Yeah.
Jumping back, we've to the New Warriors, who we think is by Bagley. I've got a comment from Cream. I love the arbitrary version of the terms, the headquarters in the 90s. Crash pad, mansion, townhomes, everything except for headquarters. They called the sneakers dad. Nobody calls them tennis shoes anymore. That's a reference to something, and I'm missing it. They call them sneakers dad. Nobody calls them tennis shoes anymore. Someone's got to give me that one, Cream. I'm missing it. Jumping forward, we've got Alpha Flight. And this is during an era where everyone is just like, it is this uniformed suit design. Like later on, I would remember that Aurora and North Star have the black and white costumes, and then Vindicator has the red, but then everyone else has kind of their own spin on whatever they want to do. And this is kind of interesting to see. I'm also curious about the design of Department H, where it's like a giant disc laying on its side. I don't know about the design. I don't know what's going on there. This one, by the way, by Tom Morgan.
Yeah, see, when you see this one, that's, if you look at the proportioning of Guardian, that kind of makes me think that New Warriors might be him too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I can see that.
And the way he's doing the rendering on all the, and look at the lips on the female characters.
Mm-hmm.
It looks very similar to what was going on in that other card.
This one here?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm the one thing that gave me pause was the fact that, like, in this one it's very clearly, but again they had more space. He's got the Morgan right here. I'm trying to circle it as best I can.
Mm-hmm.
And then also Paul got his signature in there as well. And on the other one, there's a little space on the side, but maybe he didn't want to try and fit it in. Was anybody reading Alpha Flight at this time? Either of you or those in chat?
I mean, after Burn, I didn't for a long time, and then I picked it up again on the version that Duncan Rouleau kind of got his start on, and I loved what he was doing. He had kind of a semi-cartoony style, but it was still real dramatic. And actually, it was one of the first sample sets of pages that I did that got me work in comics was based on what happened in an issue of the Duncan Rouleau version of Alpha Flight, based off of, I did my own layouts and redos of his pages from that. And so I've always thought fondly of Duncan Rouleau because I love those, that book and those pages.
Nice.
He's an awesome artist.
Yeah, he's really good. Yeah, he's got such a neat style, and I loved his sense of design for the characters in that run too.
Gotcha. Yeah, this is like I said, I was not too familiar with them. I was definitely I was aware of them, but not something I was too deep into. Next up, though, we were talking about them earlier. The Avengers West Coast, another Tom Morgan one. I love the again, we said earlier about the compound. This one's a complex, so not to be confused with the Avengers compound. This is the West Coast Avengers complex, which actually is kind of where the MCU kind of fit the original Tony Stark mansion. Like that was they took notes of this for the design. They kind of set it up like, okay, we're gonna set it up on the West Coast this time and go with these designs. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, you can really see Morgan's hips and legs in Scarlet Witch is the commonality in the last two cards as well.
Yeah.
And those lips.
I'll be right back, you guys.
Okay. Now with this one, like I do remember later on we got they ended up being called Force Works when the team evolved.
Yeah.
I can name most of these characters, but the character that's just in front of US Agent, I don't know who that is. And I'm like, I should be able to like name the majority of them, but is that Living Lightning, a different version?
Boy, that's a good question. I don't recognize that character at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the card to try and pull reference, and it says Scarlet Witch and Living Lightning, and I'm like, my exposure to Living Lightning is the, oh no, maybe I'm mixing them up with Living Laser, or
oh yeah, there's a lot of living.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could go with Living Lightning on that one because I remember it looks like he's Asian. I remember that look for his face, but I don't remember his original costume at all. So I don't know about this one.
Yeah, it's like I know. I mean, I'm familiar with Julia Carpenter. We talked about Wonder Man earlier, and also whenever I think of Wonder Man in his leisure suit version, I think that's more of a to me, like that's the original Blue and Gold, Booster Gold, and Blue Beetle kind of like the relationship, where it's like just high flying friends just doing their thing.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting. You really lose Wonder Man's legs in the back of that piece.
Yeah, because he's just just spreading his legs out, so it's just behind the two ladies, and it's just like, okay, so it's a void now. Like you don't even, I guess you barely catch a bit of his boot. Kareem saying that looks like Carlsbad, California is just a Kardashian home. Yeah, they moved in next to the Kardashians. That's good. That would be, I mean, I'd watch the Kardashians if the Avengers were next door. It could definitely make the show a lot more entertaining for me.
Curious.
Did you guys already mention that Scarlet Witch is moving her cape?
Yeah, we Drew had mentioned like just the stance was initially like the way she's essentially putting her leg out and then tucking her cape in front of her as well.
That's so weird.
I wonder if that's just to show the other characters behind her.
Yeah, well, it's the thing that's a drag is it creates a tangent where you think you should be able to see Wonder Man's red boot.
Yeah,
behind her. Yeah, yeah. What an interesting pose.
Karl, I think you stepped away just as I was starting to question this. Are you familiar with Living Lightning? Is that supposed to be him in front of the U.S. agent? That's not a character that I'm too familiar with, but
no, I don't remember him. I was about to ask who that was.
Yeah, because I mean, I'd mentioned I'm familiar with Living Laser and the supervillain, but this character is a miss in my book. I just didn't catch it.
Yeah, I think the only reason we caught him was because his name's in the back of the card.
Yeah.
Was U.S. agent? Was he Nuke?
No, this was John Walker, who would took over the mantle of Captain America for a short time, and then became U.S. agent. And then there was I think he had another title, but Nuke was another character. But again, blonde hair, blue eyes, nationalist mindset and ideas. But he might I come to think of it, he might have been Nuke in the Ultimate Universe, but that's just me. That could be me mixing up stories. But Nuke is a different character in 616.
Yeah, it gets convoluted over the time of continuity.
Yeah.
It definitely looks like the John Byrne, John Romita Jr. Iron Man.
Yeah.
This is also like the modular armor era is like one of the ones that I always loved of Iron Man, because they had done the cartoon shortly after this card set, but the cartoon set had a really good Toy Biz action figure series where all the armor would come with the figure and you could just attach it as you went. And if you wanted to, you could also swap it amongst the action figures. So if you had the War Machine, you could put the War Machine armor on Iron Man. And so I dug that whole design. Like the aesthetics were very much key for me, like when I got an idea of who Iron Man was. And it goes back to that whole headcanon, like what you find to be your favorite version.
It's so funny because like when I was growing up, I loved Iron Man. I loved all the comics. I mean, he was a favorite character of mine. I never thought he would become as popular as he has in pop culture. But when I saw that first Iron Man movie, I was like, oh, okay, they figured it out. They made the armor like a cool car.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
And it helps when you got an actor too that just like, owns the role,
Yeah.
Yeah, he made that role iconic. I mean, there's no way you could ever replace him.
Yeah.
And I mean, but if somebody would have said, who do you think is going to be the most popular Avenger? I would not have picked Iron Man when I was a kid.
I've always talked a lot with friends about like how I had always seen him as an A-lister because he was always on the Avengers in my head. Yeah. And so like I had always pictured him at that level. And then people are like, oh no, he's like C-list or lower. And I'm like, I hadn't, just because of my exposure, I hadn't seen that. And I'm sure that I can think of one person in chat that's gonna be like, because you're a moron. But that's just something that, like, from my point of view, I'd always seen, oh, he's on the Avengers, so he's A-lister. Just like you think about, oh, who's the A-listers on the Justice League? Like, they're all top tier characters. Right. And so it's like, that's kind of like what you, especially when you think of how many iterations there are and who's been the staples in each team. So, and it's funny too, one of my favorite versions of Iron Man is also the very, very short-lived young Tony Stark that gets pulled from the past into the future to fight his current evil version. And it's like, I really dug that take. I'm like, okay, we're going to see a young Tony Stark. And I've always enjoyed teen superheroes. So that was a really fun thing for me, but it seriously was over in maybe 6 issues and then it was gone. Because then we hit to Heroes Reborn and then Heroes Return, and that storyline was just dropped. But because that was one of my first exposures, and I will say too, the Jim Chung art that was on that was chef kiss. So yeah, I always dug his stuff, and then later on he went on to a litany of other things, but also the CrossGen is the first thing in my brain. But yeah,
speaking of like the Avengers and all that, when I was a kid and I was reading comics, I always felt like the Avengers and the Fantastic Four, they would take on all these, the Skrulls, Galactus, and when it was all over, they would get like a key to the city and stuff like that. And that was sort of to me what I considered to be like mainstream Marvel, what was going on in the main storyline continuity and everything. And then I always felt like the X-Men were not really part of that. They were in the same universe, but they were off on this like sort of separate thing where they were these underground outlaw type of people. And I think that's what attracted people to it. But I've talked to a lot of different people who read the kind of same era of comics, and it includes this era as well. But how there was a imagined continuity that everybody had. It wasn't really pronounced, but because you read the Marvel Universe Handbook, because you'd read the cards, you all had to share. Everybody who read the books and read all that extra stuff had a shared idea of the world. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I smoking crack?
No, I definitely get that, because you did have the X-Men in space. You had them doing stuff like the Walkabout story, and you had them in the Savage Land. Like they were a little more globetrotty, but not in the same sense that the Avengers were. Like the Avengers were in the spotlight, getting the accolades, whereas the X-Men were fighting for a world that that hated and mistreated them, but the Avengers were just like we're happy heroes, and they're doing their thing.
I just think the cards and the Marvel Universe Handbook and stuff like that, it contributed to a kind of it's in its own way created the world. It was world building kind of stuff. Because I remember going through cards, reading the back of cards. I remember, the Marvel Universe Handbook, reading every single entry. And then I remember even reading Son of Origins and all that stuff. And that kind of stuff I think is really missing in a lot of ways from current comics. Something like you said, this was your Wikipedia, this was your Google in terms of learning about the characters. I think that I know kind of continuity is sort of frowned on a little bit nowadays, but I think it was a big part of why people collected week to week.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, I agree with you completely, because, growing up, like you said, we knew everything from the origin tools that were handed to us, through like old collections that Marvel used to do and DC used to do, or trading cards, or Who's Who, or Marvel Universe. So, I mean, you had the knitted together continuity right there to look at your fingertips. And, I mean, that was the playground. But, after, I think maybe, I'd say after Image, but also I think closer to the Dan DiDio era of DC, they started throwing continuity out the window. Like it became less popular to adhere to that, and a lot of the editorial higher ups at the companies wanted to do, more, I don't know, crazy offshoot stuff, and have more room for the new creators to play. And then over the years, it just became, new creator, completely new revision of the series or what have you. I mean, we can't even, who could dare string together X-Men's continuity? Plus they've been restarted times. I mean, we don't even have original numbering on most comics anymore, and I miss that, because you knew where you were by the number. I mean, you knew what you had in your collection. The identity as a collectible is certainly gone without an adhered to continuity and adhered to numbering. It's interesting, because they always complained, a lot of people would complain that it was too hard to come into comics, like with no background, with no, you couldn't get a cold intro to comics because there's too much continuity. But now all you get is cold intros, and you don't have the teams that you grew up with, the creative teams, the superhero teams, any of that continuity that lasts more than a year or two anymore, that you get attached to, that we all got attached to.
Yeah.
Well, and we live in such like a detail obsessed era. if you were ever going to keep continuity, now would be the perfect time to do it.
Oh my God.
There's so many because the people who are into this stuff, or when you're into a specific thing, they do deep dives into all the information about it, you know?
Yeah.
What really made me think about it was how each one of these cards really represents the era that was going on. You know, it's like each Avengers team is literally what was going on in the comics. So it's like what we were talking about earlier, that we have our kind of like, what was the term you used, Ken? It was like your
head canon. Yeah.
Your head canon. Yeah. But with this, it's like, hey, you're looking at this and you're like, oh yeah, that's the John Byrne, Jared Jr., Iron Man. That's the, you know, that era. So it's very much a part of that time of that world, of that continuity, you know. So it's sort of in an odd way, sort of locked in time, you know. When I look at it, it makes me think, oh, a very specific style of storytelling, very specific continuity.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump over to comments real quick. Cream Anderson saying, well, the Avengers seem to fight to save the planet while the X-Men fought to save themselves a lot of the time. This is going back to our discussion about how the Avengers would be, you know, were essentially that they were the guys getting the key to the city. That's what that was touching base on. Alex Chung as well is mentioning, yes, yeah, I always figured Avengers and Fantastic Four were in the center of the Marvel universe.
Alex.
Yeah, New York setting. Everyone orbits around them. Yeah, because it's like, I mean, that's one thing for Marvel, is that they're decidedly set in the world. It's, you're in New York, you're in the West Coast Avengers, and they talk about like, oh no, this is over. They name cities that we live in, and they're trying to be like, this is the central hub. Was everyone was in New York, and very few kind of strayed far from that.
Do you remember? Actually, yeah, the real difference in that is that. You know, remember Secret Wars? The original Secret Wars, the X-Men were hostile to the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. You know, I mean, Wolverine was super good at them. Wolverine hated Captain America. You know,
I always thought that was oddly written, though.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was, you know, strange that they'd be.
It's my comic geek coming out. Sorry, Drew.
No, it's that's what we're here for. But we'll put a pin in that Secret Wars talk, because we do have a card to get to touch base on that.
Okay.
Oh, nice.
We're gonna keep rolling. We've got Night Stalkers by Mark Texiera, and of course,
you can tell that's him.
Yeah, and you've got, of course, Hannibal King, played by Ryan Reynolds. Remember his first comic book starring role, Hannibal King. Blade, and Frank Drake, who I am not familiar with, but has a very kind of like Alucard, like it's Dracula backwards kind of feel to him. But I don't know the character.
I don't either.
I like that it's. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry.
I'm sorry.
You think we'd have it? We're this deep into 2020. Zoom calls should be our milieu. We should be down, but it's okay. Let's go ahead and go, Carl.
I was just gonna say, I love the zipatone that he used on the background there on the city. Has a very Frank Miller, Klaus Janson look to it.
Yeah.
That's
awesome.
I'm digging it. Drew, what you had an idea?
No, I was just trying to remember the generation of the Night Stalkers, because I don't remember this version. But then there was another revamped version in the later 90s that came out. And it was weird timing. I think it was during the Midnight Suns event where they reestablished new Night Stalkers with a completely different creative team. And I don't remember this Frank Drake guy at all.
No.
Yeah.
You're not familiar with Frank Drake from Borderline Investigations Offices? That's their base of operations in Boston, Massachusetts. So yeah, that's nice. It's. I think actually the next card set. It's funny because it's like they do blend together quite a bit, but the next card set does have some of the next era you're talking about, where they also bleed over a little bit with the Darkhold Redeemers, and they have some crossover there.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Yeah. Darkhold, drawn by Richard Case. And one of those books had really early, I think it was Darkhold, that had really, really early Tony Harris art in it back before Starman by a Million Miles, too.
Gotcha. We've got Cream in chat saying, "Just call the headquarters for the love of God." Yeah, but it's an office park. Like they pay they're not zoned for a headquarters. They're zoned for a office building. So that's what they went with.
And it looks like it's maybe the third window from the left on that building. That's their office.
Yeah, they don't have the whole. They just have a suite. It's not the whole building.
Yeah, it's not the Baxter building for these guys.
Yeah, they don't have the Avengers budget here, guys. Like they're renting a small space. Unlike the Guardians of the Galaxy, who have their own starship. And so by the way, for this one, I just said it was Jim Valentino because there's no signature. But considering it's the Guardians, I thought it was a safe bet. But it's a little harder to tell because again, this art, especially you drop it down the scale so much, and you're kind of like, I'm not sure who drew this, but yeah.
I barely remember that team. I think
my question is, what was Captain America 1? The ship.
Oh, the ship. Yeah, because this is Captain America. Was that just that they had Captain America? They're like, well, we don't want to mix up our spaceship with Captain America Steve Rogers. We'll just call it Captain America 2. Was that their thought process? I'm very curious.
It looks like they stole Beta Ray Bill's ship a little bit.
Oh, I don't think I've ever seen Beta Ray Bill's ship. It's interesting too, like because of like we were talking earlier about the layout of some of these cards. Like I would expect Charlie 27 to be center and like in a strong guy pose, but then everyone else kind of flanking him. Whereas now this time he's just like off to the side, like I'm strong, guys. Like look at my muscles.
Yeah.
And like I can't even name. There's the young lady in the front. I don't know who that is in front of him. But yeah, it's kind of interesting because like I feel like there's characters missing, like Martin X and stuff. Like where, but we have Talon. They're there.
Huh.
Optimus Dixon says, barely remember that team. Yeah, like especially this particular roster. Like there's other characters that I can name, but they're not here.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I'm reading the lineup.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. I say some of the information is right in front of us, so we could have picked out that that's Nikki. Clearly, Nikki. That's Nikki. The character Nikki. Good heavens, what was?
She chews gum and her hair is on fire. That's.
Yeah.
And she looks like she's wearing maybe a cowgirl outfit a little bit.
Yeah. There's some tassels through here. I wasn't sure about that, so yeah, it's certainly an interesting choice.
Yeah. Look out! It's Nikki.
Yeah, look out. So going from this well-known character to bunch of characters to these relative C-listers, the X-Men Gold by Kirk Jarvinen. And this is great. It's funny though, because there's no this is the right era, but this was with this card set, we had Bishop as a rookie. So I'm guessing that's why he's not on here, but he was part of Gold. Like when I think of X-Men Gold, he's on this team, and Jubilee would be in there too. Oh no, Jubilee was more blue, I guess. So, but yeah, like this is. It feels like they're missing at least one other person on this card.
Yeah, that's weird too, because Colossus is the only one that has a shadow.
It's true. I do like though that he decided they're like, oh, you have to do a box on the floor. It's like, okay, I'm just going to incorporate the X, and I think he's the only one who had the chance to do that too, because everyone else, because there are 4 flyers here. Everyone else has characters covering the floor, so you didn't have that opportunity. Whereas this, you can see it, right under him.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of Jarvinen work. I remember his name, but I don't remember him ever being regular on a book.
He's done a slew of cards in this set. I'm always ready to jump back for cards especially because Karl, this is one of Karl's first times back with us. We can jump around. Let's see. I was pretty sure he did the Hulk card, but maybe I'm losing it, guys. I thought I had. There we go. There he did the Hulk for this set.
Huh.
Let's see. It's one of those things where it's like from scanning them, working on them, I guess I just saw them so many times that I'm like, oh yeah, he's here and he's here. But
yeah,
it's a little more few and far between. I'm surprised.
Interesting.
That's a pretty cool shot of the Hulk, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to realize that that kind of Professor Hulk that's in Avengers Endgame was supposed to be that version of the Hulk.
Yeah. Back when he was with the Pantheon.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like it's definitely like Professor Hulk, and then it's interesting too because it's like this one, he uses, there's some negative space that feels like there could have been a little more there, but he fits it within the card. Whereas like the Abomination that he did too, just seems to fill in all the space you need. Like let's see, he is that card, like he fills it really well. You get the impression of his size and how impressive he is.
Yeah, completely. I don't think he ever really recovered after that whole face melting incident either, because after they did this to Abomination, they never seemed to be able to settle on what he looked like ever again.
Yeah, it's definitely been kind of like up to the artist. So it's like you get, Mike Deodato wants to do it one way. Just depending on who the artist is, they're kind of like, okay, he's supposed to look like a horrific green monster, and they kind of go with whatever their hits their fancy at the moment.
Yeah.
I think. Oh, we also have a Pantheon card, and this is where I was speaking of. Like a lot of the cards seem to be on theme. So like he did the Hulk card, he did Abomination, he's doing the Pantheon.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, you just did the like X-Men related cards, didn't you, Karl?
Yeah. I mean, those were the ones that got offered. Yeah.
And so, yeah, we see. Cream says, I always felt Cyclops was overrated as a leader, especially because no one listed him. But who was the official leader of the Gold Team? That was Storm. Yeah. I mean, the back of the card says it. She was the official leader. She led the team for a bit, even when she was depowered. And she also led, to a degree, led the Morlocks for a moment. So she had a wealth of leadership experience herself.
See, I'm a huge Cyclops fan.
Yeah. There's definitely those.
My favorite X-Men leader.
There's definitely those that, especially in the chat, and also my partner Victor, he likes like this era of Cyclops, but anything past Schism where he's more like, he goes a little more militant and goes more the Magneto way, he's like, no longer a fan of Cyclops at that point. Because again, you get to that kind of that core idea of like what you tune into, like what that character should be, and the studious, like, I don't want to like say like lapdog to Professor X feel, but definitely the apple polisher Scott Summers. That's the feel that he digs in on, and everyone has their own kind of different take. And so once he started to become more like, no, Professor X, you're wrong, that's where Victor starts to depart from the character's depiction.
Yeah, I feel like
Go ahead.
I always liked that. The thing I always liked about Cyclops was he was the student that most believed in the dream, and that was the backbone, I thought, of his character. I always liked him because he was always kind of like handicapped in his own mind by his power. And my first sight of him was in an old. I think we talked about this maybe before, Ken. One of those big treasury editions you'd find at the supermarket.
Yeah, the oversized ones.
Yeah. I had the Marvel Team Up one, and it was the first time I ever saw the X-Men when I was a kid. Was the X-Men teamed up with Spider-Man, who had been apparently like somehow damaged by Morbius the vampire, and so Morbius was the bad guy in the story. And the X-Men, none of them were wearing costumes; they were just kind of on the run in street clothes, and like Scott had bandages over his eyes. He didn't even have his glasses, so every time he wanted to use his powers, he had to rip the bandages off, and otherwise he was kind of blind. And I always liked the I guess the sheer visual of that, having to rip those bandages off to unleash the immense power inside. But the fact that despite being unable to trust his own power, Scott always believed in the dream. He always believed in what Professor X had to say. So to see him go off the other direction is too radical of a departure, I think, from the character. I don't know. I mean, do you think that too, Karl, or did you like him, more militant?
Well, I always thought it was like Xavier sort of created this vision, but Cyclops was the one that had to apply the vision in the reality. Yeah. And then I actually think, starting with Giant Size X-Men all the way till the X-Men 141, 142 to Days of Future Past, that's really his story. It's really about that application of that vision. So if you read through all the Byrne issues and all that, all the other characters are pretty peripheral. And then if you notice, like right at the end when Jean Grey dies, which to me is kind of like, you see it's the death, and then you see what the future could be and that they want to avoid that future. And then that's when you see kind of where Chris Claremont takes on more of the writing and control of the book. And then that's when you see a lot of exploration of other characters as being the potential leaders, which I consider that to be the Storm era, where Storm kind of becomes the leader and Cyclops sort of fades into the background. But they keep that storyline, that Jean Grey, him and Jean Grey thing is just such a, it's like the Daredevil Electra type thing. It's a storyline that just keeps giving. So they kept, rerouting it back into the main storyline. I mean, if you think about it, even all the way up to Mutant Massacre, right? I mean, you're still dealing with Jean Grey.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is like 250 issues or something like that.
Yeah, she was dead for a really long time, but she was always still kind of there. Yeah, I mean, she was never forgotten, and her presence was always felt, I thought.
Even when it was a genetic clone of her named Madeline Pryor, because they're like, oh yeah, she looks just like Jean, but no one can recognize that. And you gotta love comics.
Yeah. It's funny. The first whole issue of X-Men that I ever read was the funeral issue for Jean, where Cyclops recaps the entire history of the X-Men. And, he basically says it's the story of him and Jean. And, you roll through that with all the beautiful artwork by John Byrne. And that was, one of the things that turned me on to John Byrne early. It was a great point to pick that book up, because it handed you all the continuity and the understanding of the Cyclops Jean Grey storyline as well, just being the backbone of the thing. It was heavy. I mean, and the way he leaves it at the end, I had never read an issue of it before, and yet I felt emotion for this guy. It's a hell of an issue. I always loved it. I read it to death so bad. It was wrinkled cover, folded pages on the inside. I mean, it just dragged it around before I even knew anything about comic collecting, and just drew pictures out of it and such.
Oh yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah.
Jumping to the chat, they say, I think Punisher line works for everyone. You're just one bad day away from being me, and the same goes for Cyclops, especially having Professor X keep muddying the message of his own personal tinkering. And there's they did touch on stuff like that too with Professor X, of him himself not living up to the dream, and some of the darker stuff that he had done that we kind of discover during Onslaught, and kind of post that with the Danger Room and what that was. And we definitely, and that's kind of where we get that line breaking for Cyclops.
Yeah.
And that character shift.
Now that's the point where our conversation about continuity, I think, kind of comes under a little bit of fire, because I think if continuity is allowed to continue for too long, then the characters kind of reach past where they should go. And then those are the kind of stories that can become the only opening for the creative team to go in, like turning somebody bad like Professor X and the dark history of Professor X, I think. I mean, I don't know what you guys think, but
yeah, it's an interesting take.
Yeah, I mean, taking the Punisher as a note, like there was a time where they're like, they kind of hit peak Punisher for me in the 90s, where like, oh, we're going to team up the Punisher with Ghost Rider and Wolverine. And they did this story, not Midnight Suns, Spirits of Vengeance. God, we did a card of it, and like that was kind of like, oh, that was the great time. But then eventually they got to the point where like we don't know what to do else with Punisher. Let's kill him. So they killed the Punisher, and then he became an angel hunting demons because he couldn't stay in hell and he couldn't stay in heaven, and like that part's just kind of. I think if there's as far as continuity goes, they then shifted. They brought him back to life, and at one point he even became Frankenstein. And it's like if you take it all in canon, as it all in continuity, it's a really muddled mess. But then you can still come back from that and have character stories like Welcome Back, Frank, where you have just like the hard boiled Punisher stories. And if you lift that out, it works. If you put it in, it doesn't. It's a bit goofy because I mean I think that's also the era where you have when it's the Max line where you have the Russian who eventually gets his head transplanted onto a woman's body who's like also just as powerful. It is wacky. And it's like, but they're trying to keep the same through line of this is the same Punisher who was hired to kill Spider-Man because he was misinformed that he was actually hurting people. And now you look at him as like, how did we get here? And if you take it all as in one story, it doesn't work, but you can still get stories that are going to work from that later on. Like I think I'm trying to remember what his most recent story was that worked well for a lot of people, and now I'm drawing a complete blank. But it's been more of that Max line stuff where like, no, what if we put Punisher in just put him off to the side? Like he's not really in the Marvel universe; he's just adjacent, and that's worked out really well. And so it's like,
well, the guys in my studio were all madly in love with that Ghost Rider. Is it Ghost Rider 2099 or Cosmic Ghost Rider?
Cosmic Ghost Rider, who is Frank Castle,
Beard
of Vengeance, on a space bike, who's the herald of Thanos.
Oh God, really?
Yeah.
I didn't read it, but my God, they were all in love with that book, man. They were just like, this is the new thing. Oh, and I was just like, he's got a jar on his head. I mean, what?
and why? Is it because of the fire? It can't be in space, but it's hellfire. But I don't know. And hey, I think Tony Moore did some of that art, and it's great. And so it's like I like to keep as much continuity as I can within my headspace, and you just have to acknowledge some of it is just not going to fit. And I guess that comes into that headcanon idea of just like, I'm going to acknowledge what I want to acknowledge, and I won't say that didn't happen. I just said like, I'm just going to ignore it for the most part, and if someone else loves it, good on you. Like I'm glad you enjoyed comics, and that's always what I want. Someone in chat is saying, spoiler alert, fair enough. I did not warn anyone. Sorry about that, guys. And then Alex Chung is mentioning that Punisher Soviet, Garth Ennis and Barrow's book. Yes. That one was doing really well.
Yeah, Alex jumps out with the encyclopedic knowledge here.
Definitely.
Yeah, I almost think though that with comics and comics continuity, that it's like you find a sweet spot for not only the character, but the kind of world around the character, right? Like when I think of Gotham for Batman, I kind of think of this sort of retro architecture, and I imagine it a certain way, right? I think that sometimes they should work continuity, but within that space. It's like when I think of Harry Potter, I think of Hogwarts, I think of all the different elements that create it. Same thing with Star Wars. I think there's a certain aesthetic to it, and I feel like comic books has kind of always felt like, oh, well, we need to totally interrupt that and bring in something really different to sort of that's going to get us new readers or something like that. Where I think what they want, what I think a lot of readers like, is they want to know the consistent elements. They want to know the world. They want to know the characters. And then they want to see what kind of stories can you tell within that space. Yeah. And that's where I think that there's an issue between continuity and it's sort of evolving into like, oh, how do we one up and do a stunt versus how do we reiterate the kind of brand pillars, that you have within that character. So that's what I feel kind of happened with X-Men. I felt like X-Men had Chris Claremont steering the ship for such a long time that he created a world within a world, and the more they got off, it's just my personal thoughts, but I think they went off into a direction that was they stopped telling stories about the characters and started telling stories more about the concept of X-Men. And I think that the thing that attracts people to any type of storytelling, but especially comics, is the characterizations. That's just my personal thoughts. But, you know, even you see that in the Marvel movies. It's, if someone would, you know, I remember when the Captain America movie came out, people were like, oh, it's going to be so boring. It's going to be so lame. But by the time Cap's catching Thor's hammer about to crush Thanos, you're like, I love this guy. I could do this all day. You know, everybody, and it's the characterization of him.
And the consistency. Yeah, like, because you had the same writers from all three, from even though it was a different director for the first movie, which definitely made that feel like a movie serial from the 40s and 50s, but the same writers were on that, and then they went into Winter Soldier. So you had that consistency of character that even though you had essentially a different artist presenting it between the two movies, because the Russos did Winter Soldier, you still had that same core writing style to make that character, between the writers and between Chris Evans, to portray that character the same throughout. And so that's where you have that consistency of heart, or the core character is there. And that's one thing that too, I mean, we talking about how trying to gain new readers, but then at the loss of story. I think Marvel, during the 90s, Marvel did a lot of great things to bring on new readers, but then there's also a shift into like, okay, now we're just going to lock into who we have. And they departed from trying to bring in young readers. And through the 2000s, there's a drop off in kind of kids accessible books and kids accessible properties. And they were just like, oh no, this is the 90s and everything's extreme with an X. And it shifts that way. And things like the X-Men trading cards, I think, were a great gateway drug for me. And they found ways to keep kids involved. And when you have young readers titles, there's a great one that Chris Samney did. I want to say it was with Mark Waid, but now I'm questioning that. With Thor. And it was an all ages book, and it was its own storyline of Thor coming to Earth and meeting Jane Foster. But at its very heart, it was just Thor being mystified by the world of Midgard, of Earth, and being like, oh, well, what is this? How does this work here? And Jane playing that like, oh, well, this is what's going on, and her introducing him to that world. And it was that core idea of what Thor was, so that when someone got brought in by this book, when they went to the next Thor series, as long as Thor was still Thor, you still had a good reader. Someone's like, okay, I'm on board for this next story and this next story, because they always have that heart of what Thor is supposed to be. And you can always have it with a different through a different lens or different shade, but you're still getting that core idea. And I think that's lost sometimes when they're like, okay, now time for a new number one, and now this time Spider-Man's got this adventure, and it's just like, it doesn't feel like Peter Parker, and I don't know, it gets lost. You don't know who this version of Peter Parker is, completely different from this previous writers.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's funny that I think that in comic books, there always has to be this distinction between this is like an all ages concept, or this is a kid concept, or an edgy concept, or whatever. What I think the Marvel movies captured was that ability to not talk down, but not be so edgy that you alienate kids and you alienate older fans who love the characters. And I think that's what the 70s, 80s, and sort of tragically ended midway through the 90s, is that there was this kind of understanding that you created, the comic books were read by kids, teens, adults who just like fantasy adventure stories or superheroes, and they found that sweet spot. And I think Marvel was so great at that, and that's what you see in the movies, I think. And I think by doing that, they were able to sort of create tons and tons of characters that you never saw them say bad words. If somebody did die, it almost happened off screen or off panel, you know, and it was just a smart way to create stories. And I think they worked within a limited palette that they had, in terms of they couldn't do certain things, so they didn't do them. They just worked hard to tell a story around it, you know. And then the minute you started seeing edgier versions of the characters, which I can say guilty as charged because I was part of the Image era, and you started seeing these sort of either more violent or more sexualized versions of the characters. It took it out of that space, not completely, but slightly. And then there was a reaction to a reaction to a reaction. But if I was to say what truly started all this was Watchmen, because Watchmen was the first book that really showed superheroes in this much edgier fashion, and I know that's been talked about a million times, but you really didn't see the effect of that until the 90s, where it sort of had been building towards that. But I don't know how we got onto this thing, but it just, to me, I think that there's a sweet spot that was recaptured in the movies that you saw in the comics, which I think could also be done in the comic books today if they were willing to commit to that kind of storytelling.
Yeah, I think too that they would need to commit to bringing back long-lasting creative teams. I mean, they've worked so hard to break
up.
It's a
huge issue.
Yeah, it's just they keep trying to keep anybody from getting famous or getting any kind of power in the industry, and that's a whole weird side thing. The important thing is that you're giving the audience a continuous creative team that they can settle in with and enjoy, and know kind of what they can expect in terms of what they're going to get from the comic books that they're reading. When I was a kid, I remember being able to go back, every month expecting that I was going to have some artist that I really loved teamed with some writer that I really loved. It was my reason for going back every time. And one of the things that really stopped me from going to the comic book store anymore as I got older, especially in recent years, was that I'm not attached to anything in modern comics.
Yeah.
And that bums me out. I want to be.
I mean, that's definitely, I mean, it's a discussion I've had with my wife because she comes from, she read some comics as a kid, but she also read a lot more manga. And there you've got, one writer artist usually, or, maybe a team, and they do the entire story together consistently for the entire run. Mm-hmm. And that's just, and so when you have someone that story is always going to be pretty it's coherent because it's just that one team making that story. One of the first books I gave her that I was like, oh, hey, if you want to read something that I really love, check this out, was Ultimate Spider-Man. And that's Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley just hammering out Spider-Man at
issue
after issue, and sometimes 2 per month during certain eras. And they were just and also Bagley was also working on other titles still too, and in some fillers. It was crazy. But you have that consistency of that team, and so you always had that same through line. Everything had that the life that was given to it by these creators, and that's just something that's definitely lost in comics now. Aside from kind of not to use the name stunt as a bad thing, but with Hickman getting his X-Men stuff, he's getting to control so much of the X-Men, but it's definitely still jumping between artist to artist to artist, and so you're not getting that same consistency, and it's definitely a little more jarring.
Yeah,
I don't know if jarring, but yeah, it's not what you had for some of the longer runs.
Yeah.
I was going to say.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, just in the chat, Optimus Dixon mentions Gold Digger, most consistent team. No, they're not that. That's not consistently good. So sorry, Dixon. I'm sorry. I make jokes about Gold Digger because they have a leprechaun mecha in one of the issues, and I wrote them off, and it's more of an inside joke between us. So I apologize to Fred Perry because I know he's watching, and I hope your series continues on. But sorry, Carl, you were saying.
I was just going to say to your point and to Drew's point, I'd say a modern version that proves this out, modern comic that proves this out would be The Walking Dead. It's every trade, every issue. It was so consistently written, consistently drawn. And that's why so many people outside of comic books read it. Because there were people before the show started that were getting into it. I remember hearing about it, reading 6 trades before the show even came out, something crazy like that. And when people who transitioned from the show into watching it, man, they had tons and tons and tons of content similar to manga that was done by a consistent team, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that that's a huge issue with comics too, is you may like, let's just say, for example, you like Iron Man and you like a particular team and you go buy a trade and 4 of the chapters are done by the team you like. And the 5th one is done by someone that you're like, I don't know who this is. And it looks really different. And I've done that where I've given a trade paperback to somebody who doesn't read comics and they're like, what happened to the artwork? Why did it change? Like they don't understand it at all. And it really, I think, creates a lot of, it's off-putting to a lot of readers. So in terms of bringing new readers in, I think a lot has to do with it being done the same every single time. So when they come there, they know exactly what they're going to get. And I think that's what new readers want.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's consistency, man. I mean, it's a quality guarantee. I mean, I think up into the 90s, you had a pretty good idea of, there's going to be a certain number of books that your favorite artist on that book was going to do. And then there'd be like a fill-in or two to, cut him some slack and let him get caught up. And then he'd come back again. Like I remember, I was big into, I want to say it was like the end of 89, early 90, the Keith Giffen Legion of Superheroes 5 years later plotline. I was so into that book, and like I could expect that, Giffen would be drawing it and writing it pretty much every issue, and then when there'd be a sub come in for the art, it would be like a speed bump happening, and like then Giffen would come back and everything was all right again, and then speed bump, and then when they transitioned to Chris Sprouse doing a long run on the new Legion of Superheroes books, that storyline, those teams carried me through I don't know how many issues. I mean, it had to have been, I don't know, 40, 50, maybe more issues. I don't know how long that went on. It went on for ages, what they started. And I was crazy about it. And there's just nothing like that at all anymore, man. I wanted to get into the new X-Men stuff, and I loved what they were doing when they did the first initial series for it. And then they just went and tons of different directions and tons of different creative teams and tons of different artists. And I just didn't have a latch on point, so I didn't stick with anything.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I'm going to jump back to chat real quick. Devil's Advocate, this is in reference to The Walking Dead. Devil's Advocate, it was consistently repetitive. Find a home, fuck it up with internal politics, zombies overrun it, find a new home, rinse and repeat. That's definitely, there were, yes, I agree. It was definitely repetitive to that regard. They did try and change some of the stories up to get a little more like, oh, well, this one's going to be, this is a different take and it's a slight variance, but I do see what you're saying there. On that note, is on a side note for myself, because I read Walking Dead, like I picked up the very first issue, I fell in love with the Tony Moore art. So it's like when I got 6 issues in, and I'm like, oh, this is great. And then issue 7 comes out, and it's Charlie Adler. I'm like, what's this guy doing here? Where's Tony Moore stuff? And I was more familiar with Tony Moore from the different stuff that he'd done with Kirkman before, as far as like Battle Pope and other books. And so for me, switching over to Charlie was like, oh, this is jarring. I still stuck with it because I thought it was a good story. And then of course Charlie went on to do so much of his stuff, but there's still that part of me where it's like, oh, I really enjoy Tony Moore's like his detail that he would put into that stuff. Those first 6 issues I think are really beautiful.
Yeah,
in a grotesque, dark way. Like it's beautiful within context.
Funny similar story to that. When I was a kid, when I got into X-Men when post-Burn, when Dave Cockrum was drawing it, and I was such a huge fan of it from that year, which is crazy, right? And then they switched to Paul Smith, who is a fantastic artist, right? And I remember opening up the issue as a kid, and I was just like, what have they done? They ruined this whole comic. Oh my God. I was like so beside myself, upset. And then I became a huge Paul Smith fan and all that. But it's just a similar thing. In my mind, I was like, I'm sure when people went from Byrne to Cockrum, they were like, what the hell? And here I am, from Cockrum to Paul Smith. I'm like, oh my God, it just looks so weird.
I'm right there with you, because I had a hard time transitioning to Smith. And then when I did, and they transitioned to John Romita Jr., I was like, no, what? No. And, and I'd just been like that about Paul Smith before. But, you get time to settle into that style and appreciate it and live with it. And then, and I did eventually come around on Junior too, because they got to do good long runs where you really got a chance to, number one, see them settle into the book and then make it their own and do their best work on it. I think that means a lot. And you're sad.
Well, could you imagine? Oh, go ahead.
Well, that was it. I was going to say, you're sad to see them go when they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But can I imagine?
I was going to say, could you? Oh, I'm sorry, dude. Go ahead.
No, I was picking up your thread. Can I imagine what?
Oh, I was just going to say, could you imagine these long-running manga like One Piece or My Hero Academia, and you're reading it and you're enjoying it, and then all of a sudden a volume comes out and it's a completely different style. I mean, you would just be like, whoa, this is so weird. Why would they do that? And that happens in comics. Like now it happens like every 2 or 3 issues.
Yeah. And it happens. I think another factor that we're not mentioning too is that they are not giving, at least from the outside looking in, I don't think they're giving enough time and pay to the artists and to keep up with what they want. Like they want a page rate that's affordable, and they want a speed that's going to be up to their standards of filling in gaps. And it's like, well, a working artist can only go so fast, and they can only pump out so much work. And so now you're like, okay, well, we need to find a fill-in artist for here, because as much as we love an artist who I like, but definitely has fallen behind sometimes, like Brian Hitch. I think he's done some great stuff, but he's fallen behind. And so they're like, well, do we put in a fill-in artist, or do we just wait for him? And so that's another thing where it's like, either give enough time for the artist to complete the project, or like find another way to then just drop in like, oh, this is a filler artist for this one issue. It's like, but that throws off the tempo of the story for us. And I don't think editorial or the higher ups see that as an issue. They're just like, well, we got to hit those dates, because if we're solicited, we have to hit this date. Otherwise we can't resolicit. And they're caring about other things. And that's a thing that others might not know about. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, this kind of takes me back to like conversations, Carl, we used to have in the Coffee and Comics group back in the day, where, like I would always go on about how when I first started in comics at DC, I would be doing a gig for a book that wasn't going to come out for 6 months, maybe more. So I'd have time to work on the book. And then there'd also be time for changes. Like editorial could come in and say, we don't feel like this panel's working. Could you just redo it real quick? And then they'd FedEx the page back to me instead of, like now I have digital to go with. But, it was a whole process where I felt like the product was made as good as it could be made and then put out. And I think that ended right around the New 52, because then they decided to start really speeding out books. And then it became putting on alternating teams, and they get so behind. There's so many changes going on that they don't have time to make, that, the art team gets thrown out with the bathwater, and everything gets confusing, and there's no consistent product.
Yeah, I think you both are totally 100% correct, in that the comic book artists are underpaid for what they do, but also too, comic books has changed so much in terms of what the expectation for the penciler is supposed to do. Like back in the day when you would see pencils, they were pretty loose.
Yeah.
And the inker, and this is when John Byrne could do 3 books a month, because he was jamming out 3 pages. Kirby would do, and I'm talking about guys who are probably above the norm in terms of their ability to crank out material. John Romita Jr., same thing like that. But the expectation became, I want to create tighter pencils, because a lot of comic book artists use the sale of their original art to subsidize their living. So if you're sitting there saying, if I do a bad page, I'm not going to be able to sell this, so you're sitting there saying, well, I better detail the heck out of this, or I better put as much tight pencils so that if it does get inked, it doesn't get changed very much. There's like this whole thing of where selling the original art should be part of your profit versus what is helping you to survive. There's that element of it. Also too, I think the expectation of the consumer hasn't been managed very well, in the sense that, the coloring style changed in comics, the paper that's on it has changed, everything about it has been deluxed up. But sometimes if you think about what the consumer really wants, they probably want more story. They probably want more of the actual content. So when you see like something like manga, where someone's paying $8 for an 88 page or 125 page book, and they're flying through it, you know what I mean? And it's all black and white. There's no color. So that takes away a cost. It also takes away production time. There's all these different moves that you could make, I think, to make a product that more people want or more people enjoy. You look at someone like Mike Mignola, right? If you look at the way his work is colored, it's pretty much just well thought out flat colors.
Yeah.
But it works perfectly well with his style.
Yeah.
And I think not every comic needs full digital color.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem. I think there should be tiers. There should be different ideas for how who are they positioned for, what kind of consumer, because I think there's a certain thing that was going on with comic books years ago, where you would go in there and you would say, this is an entertainment buy for myself. So I'm going to spend $25 and I'm going to get 10 comics or something, or more, back in the day. And you'd walk out of there and you'd have a couple hours of enjoyment. And then you'd have the collector's element where you bag and board them and put them in there. And then I know this is something that a lot of comic book people used to do too, is after they got 10 or 20 of them, this was before trades were big, they would take them all out, put them in a pile, and just read them all again.
Yeah.
Re-experience it, like watching a DVD one more time, or watching, a movie again.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the more things move towards everything being a graphic novel, the more it cannibalized the person who would be the consumer of a less expensive comic.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Yeah, I think it was. I just want to add one last point on in terms of what's expected from the artists. I want to say it was a conversation, Karl, we had once. I think it was you that had explained to me. Maybe it wasn't. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry. That a lot of us, when we were kids, didn't understand what an inker did, and we thought that was the final product. So we thought we had to pencil to that.
Yeah.
And that's how I grew up. Like my pencils, used to be, I mean, they're different now because of digital, but my pencils are so tight because I thought that's what they had to be, or I wasn't doing my job. And that would cause me to take longer because my pencils were impeccable going out the door. And that's what I thought it had to be. And then everybody who really knows anything about comics was looking at my work going, are you insane? And that was all I knew how to do. I mean, that was,
yeah.
There was
we did have that conversation.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I was going to say there's a story that Todd Knock has mentioned a few times where he was getting his portfolio reviewed, and this is early on, like probably I think just before Extreme era stuff, where he was getting reviewed. They're like, oh, they're looking at stuff. It's like, okay, well, do you want to be an inker or a penciler? And he's like, well, I want to do pencils. He's like, okay, then stop working on your inks. Like, this is what you're working towards. Keep focusing on that. And like someone else will come back and ink it. And so that's where he learned, like essentially by trying to accomplish everything, his work was suffering overall. And that when he was able to focus, like, oh, I'm just going to focus on pencils. Well, I can just put all that extra time I'm putting here, I can just focus on the pencils. And that's when his art started to grow more.
Yeah.
And I know a couple of different artists myself who are, I think their pencils are phenomenal, and then when it's like, because they are forced to, like, oh well, we can't afford to pay an inker, so you're gonna have to do this too. And it's like, I mean, I've only got so much time, so I've got to double down on this work too. And like, no, the company should be paying for the inkers to come in and finalize that art. Like, that's part of the step. Essentially, you're putting double duty on one person at that point. And that's just like, that's where it's, I don't know.
That's a really interesting take. I think that's it's really interesting, because I think there's a lot of different ways that people kind of come into doing it, in the sense that there's some people, like, well, first off, I think all the best inkers are actually really good at drawing.
Yeah.
So like, if you look at like a Klaus Janson or a Terry Austin or a Scott Williams, Will Spartasio, before he became a penciler, he was an inker. He inked Longshot. So you would see these guys that were the best inkers would always have that extra gear of being able to draw, because they could figure out, they could interpret the pencils and bring about what you're talking about, that final line art, But I don't know if it's something where, because to me, penciling and inking aren't separate.
Right. I was just saying,
I think, like,
I was just saying, for some artists, I think that they are forced to carry both batons, when really, like, their focus could be on one, and you'd have the product could be better for it with the this artist in particular. Whereas, like, nowadays, they're not given the chance to hone their skills one way or the other.
Yeah. I also have this belief that, like, for example, if you penciled something and I inked it, it would look different from if you penciled and inked it and if I penciled and inked a piece. But we would create a third artist that's not you, that's not me, that is this other guy. Do you know what I mean? It's me making choices over the decisions you made as a penciler, right? Yeah. So I think if you had someone, well, first off, Todd Knock is, I know Todd, that dude is super fast. He could have done 3 books, you know what I mean, in terms of pencils. Dude's super fast. And but who would you pair with him to get the most out of his work? And that's there's 2 different sort of mindsets. You're thinking, well, who do I team with him that can create good looking artwork that fits the story, that fits all that stuff, but will get it done in a timely manner, right? So you have those thoughts, whether it's, are you going for an artistic kind of level, or are you going for a speed level? Are you going for, like, we want to get out a lot of books this month, or it depends on where it's coming from. Like, if Todd was doing a creator-owned book, I would think, like, oh, cool, he should probably ink himself, because he has a very distinct vision of what he wants from his creator-owned book. But if he was doing Team Titans, or he was doing, Impulse or something like that, I would say, oh, cool, maybe you should put, Norm Rapman on him or something in one of those books, because that would be so cool. That'd be a good look. It fit it.
Yeah.
So I think it depends on which company it's for, who's making it, who's, what's the team. There's all those kind of considerations. But I do think you're right that a lot of people nowadays, especially with the digital era, a lot of guys like, why do I do finished pencils when I could just click on a different icon and do finished inks? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I've seen a lot of people that don't even do pencils. They skip pencils. They just do layout, and then they just do finished inks digitally, because it's really the same thing.
Yeah, that's what I do now.
Yeah.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah. I do scribbly layouts, and then I go right to the board. I drop drop the opacity on the layouts, and then just start working over them. But I work through the pencils as I used to, and I just finish them. And because it's all done, in black already, I just do all my weight lines as I'm drawing my final illustration, and I'm done. Whereas I used to draw the whole drawing and then go in with the ink and draw it again.
Yeah.
And, enhance it as I could, and if there's anything extra I wanted to do to it. But the wonderful thing about digital is it's allowed me to skip a lot of steps and streamline my process.
Yeah, That's awesome. And yeah, it kind of definitely comes down to the artist like yourself, where you're like, like he was saying, like that where you want that weighted line to be, and so yeah, and we went through a wide range of topics there at the end, from like from consistency to art and ink, and I'm glad it's definitely some of the comments seem to be loving it. They love the idea of the third guy, essentially the third artist that we create together, as working together between inker and penciler. See, Radnewt Andy had asked, some artists would choose to ink their own stuff, and Karl definitely covered that. Depending on the artist, like Mike Mignola is definitely one who I could think of, like, oh no, he has a vision, let him put that across to you. Whereas like you definitely, and it's interesting too, because like there are artists as well where they've even put out books that are just the penciled version because people are going to be ready to buy that. I think of like the Jim Lee Unwrapped stuff for DC, as well as a few other. I think Andy Cooper did one as well. Yeah,
Greg Capullo did one.
Yeah, Greg Capullo did one for the Court of Owls. Sorry, my brain. But yeah, so it's like
I want to. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay.
I was just going to say, by the way, man, you have to pencil something, and I have to ink it so we can meet that third guy.
Yeah.
I'm serious. I'm not joking. Next time you pencil something, let me know.
I would love to, honestly. I mean, because your line is so delicate. I've always liked it. I thought I want to say we screwed around with that once at Coffee and Comics, but we didn't really get to finish it. But yeah, I'd love to mess around with something like that.
Yeah, you guys pencil something, I'll ink it.
Yeah, it's the collaborative third guy you create. I mean, that's fascinating. That's where we get into like the really nitty gritty of the comic art form. I just love that collaborative effort and that third product that comes out. It's utterly fascinating.
Like, speaking of Mike Mignola, when he gets inked by P. Craig Russell,
I
actually love that version of Mike Mignola.
Yeah,
I know everybody likes the more kind of Hellboy version, but I like the little ornate version that creates. But personal,
or Kevin Nolan. Kevin Nolan does a nice job on him too.
Yeah, but Kevin Nolan is like a Klaus Janson type guy in the sense that when he inks you, he inked you.
Yeah, totally.
Well, guys, we are rounding up at about 2 hours, and so that's normally kind of where we start to wind down. We got through a good batch of cards. We still have some more to cover. We will actually likely be back next Friday, which is normally not our schedule. We're every other Friday, but next Friday, Victor and I will be back to cover the last of the cards and also start to talk about where Comic Banter is going to start going from here on out. We're still going to do cards, but we're also going to start doing what if stories and a couple different comic book stories and trying to change up the format a bit. Of course, we're going to try and always have some creators, if we can, come on, someone who worked on them and different stories that they've enjoyed. But yeah, that's our plans for next week. Karl, where can people find you on the internet? What else can they look out for yours to try and pick up to support you?
Well, you can find me at Comic Karl at Instagram, and the comic is spelled with a K and the Karl is spelled with a K. And of course on Facebook, I have an art page there. Within that, there's links to my Big Cartel store where I sell original art and some of my comics and stuff. But if you want to see my art, all the time, Instagram's probably the best place.
Yeah. And Drew, same for you. I know that you also have an Instagram and a few other spots to check out.
Yeah. Like Karl, a lot of my work is on Instagram, a little bit on Twitter now and again, and some on Facebook. I have an art page, Art of Drew Edward Johnson on Facebook, and it's all under Drew Edward Johnson. I gave up trying to be creative with my names ages ago because I realized nobody was actually finding me when I was called Graphite Monkey. So just Drew Edward Johnson on Instagram, Drew Edward Johnson on Twitter. It's it's the same everywhere.
You gave up your CB handle?
Yeah, man. I wanted to be cool, but it just wasn't working out.
I mean, it was the 90s and 2000s. You could only have so many fierce angels out there, and like pyro turtles. So there's only like there was an era where that was the thing. I mean, people can still find me on Xbox's Lost Chance. So good luck with that, guys.
Nice.
But gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you guys coming out. I want to say also thank you to everyone in chat who joined us and had some comments to say and throw at us. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. I do see we already have a little bit of feedback here too. Kareem, thanks, Carl. I appreciate the insight. Now I need to find out where Coral wandered off to. Coral. But yes, and then to Optimus Dixon, Fred Perry next week. If you have his contact information, feel free to provide it to me, and I will definitely reach out to him. But I don't have any contact info for him. Gentlemen, thanks again for coming out. We appreciate you joining us. Guys, be sure to be back next week when Victor and I start to wrap up Marvel Universe Series 3.
Thanks, Ken. It was awesome.
No problem.
Thanks.